Finally, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark II. Let's go check out these cameras, shall we? Okay, so before we start, to all you new subscribers, thank you. I'm super excited about the community that we're building here, and I look forward to meeting you online. And if you're new here, we do simple to understand photography and video tutorials, insights, and reviews. So hit that subscribe button, you won't be sorry. So on to the Xperia. First, I'm not going to go into all the specs on this phone. There are plenty of other videos out there that go into deep detail of all the specs and features, including a video that I did a few months ago that previewed the Sony Xperia 1 Mark II. I'll link that below if you want to check that out. But today we're going to solely focus on the cameras and the photography and video capabilities of this phone. So if that's not what you're interested in, you can click off now. That's what we're gonna be focused on. And if you are interested in the cameras, we're going to go over all 3 apps that are included with this phone. We're going to go over all 3 cameras and their performance. We're going to look at some example images. We'll compare them to the Pixel 4 and even the Sony a7R III in some raw images. But first, I should note that I've been waiting for this phone for a while now, and I've been looking at other reviews, and I've been pretty disappointed at what the reviewers have been talking about and focused on. I mean, let's face it, this phone was not made for the average consumer. This phone is clearly targeting the photographers and videographers of the world. So I've been disappointed that most reviewers have just popped open the phone, threw it on the regular camera app, tried to take photos against the iPhone or the Pixel or Samsung and other phones, and they've been disappointed, which is not surprising because this phone was not made to just be using that main photo app. Now, don't get me wrong, we're going to look at that, especially against the Pixel, and I've got the images that we're going to go over here, but we're also going to dive deeper into the Pro Photo app and a little bit into the Pro Video app, Cinema Pro. And so by the end of this video, you should have a pretty good idea of whether or not this phone was made for you. But as a little refresher, let's go over the 3 lenses that come with this phone. As I said, there are 3 lenses. They all use Zeiss T-Star coated glass to reduce ghosting and flares. You have your regular wide, an f1.7 aperture, 24mm full frame equivalent. You have your ultra wide, an f2.2 aperture, 16mm full frame equivalent. And you have a zoom lens, an f2.4 70mm full frame equivalent. All 3 lenses use 12 megapixel sensors. First, a note on the sensor size, that 12 megapixels doesn't sound like a lot, especially when you have some phones like the Samsung that are running around with 108 megapixels or something like that. But you have to remember that the sensor size is what really matters. And if you have a ton of pixels, they're going to be smaller to fit into that small sensor. And the smaller the pixels, the more difficult it is for them to catch light, and that will affect your photo negatively. So don't worry about the fact that this only has 12 megapixel sensors in it. It's plenty enough to take extremely good photos, and we're going to see plenty of examples of that here. So first, let's look at the standard photo app, the kind that you would find in any other phone that's included with this.
Okay, so what we have here is our basic camera app, our Cinema Pro app, and our Photo Pro app. But first, let's look at the regular photo app. And when you pull it up, it looks like any other photo app. You've got your shutter button, you've got your choice between the camera and the video, you've got a mode button here, you've got your lenses, your portrait lens, your wide angle, and your super wide angle. So that would be the 70, the 24, and the 16. And then the upper left hand corner, you've got your settings, and in here you can have a self timer, you can choose your image size, which will change the megapixel count for your image. You can do object tracking. There's a soft skin effect, and you can turn that on for portraits or selfies. I personally don't like it on. You'll see some of that later. And then you've got your GPS and other settings. And this will bring up your brightness level. So a little slider, you can dial up or down just like the Pixel or the iPhone. And then here you've got kind of a white balance. You can warm up the image or you can cool it down. A little slider there. This is where you can choose your aspect ratio. And then here you've got an option to blur an object. And I get this message a lot that I need to move further away from the object. Even though this is about 2 feet from the lens, it still feels like it's too close, I guess. And we'll look at that again later. It almost makes it look like a tilt shift lens. And of course you can't zoom in with the effect on, but you can choose to kind of blur the background a little bit if you want to. And in the modes, you can choose, you can go to Photo Pro, you can do Google Lens, and if you've seen that, it will determine what you're looking at and pull up a page of information on it. You can do some slow motion, a portrait selfie. There's some creative effects. So you can do some real contrast, some hue saturation, mirror, some effects if you want. And then the last thing you could do is a panorama. You can see your last effect that you used will be right here next to that mode button. Okay, so let's jump into Lightroom and we'll look at some of the photos that I got with both the Pixel and the Xperia at the ghost town. Okay, so we've got our first image here, and what I tried to do is take the exact same photos with the Pixel as I did with the Sony Xperia, and you can see here that the images look pretty similar. The Xperia looks a little bit more vibrant, especially in the sky, and the Pixel looks just a little bit more contrasty. So if we kind of zoom in here, you can see on the tires there's just a little bit more contrast and maybe just a touch more detail because of that. But all in all, it's a pretty solid first image for the Sony, and I found that for most of the photos, this is kind of what it looked like, that the images were pretty similar in feel and tone, although the Xperia does come out just a little bit more vibrant, and the Pixel has just a little bit more contrast, which makes it appear a little bit sharper in some instances. So then in our next photo, kind of a similar situation. The Pixel comes out to be just a little bit more muted and a little bit more contrasty, and the Xperia, again, you can see in the sky and the pink of this car that it looks just a little bit more punchy with the colors. And in our next image, a little bit of a higher contrast situation, and again, it'd be hard to tell just taking a glance at these photos which one was which, but if we zoom in a little bit, you can see that the Pixel, again, looks a little bit more muted, and the Xperia looks just a bit more punchy with the colors. Although if I was forced to choose which one looked sharper, I would have to say the Pixel, because again, if you look at the contrast just up here in the sign, you could see that it's just a little bit more clear, and up here in the rafters, that contrast just helps pull out the detail in those lower light areas. And in our next photo, you can see here that the Pixel does a pretty good job dealing with this high contrast situation with the super bright sky and that sun washing over these cactuses, cacti, and the Xperia kind of struggles with this super bright sky here, and the light is kind of muted on the cacti, and again the HDR capabilities of the Pixel come out here, and that computational imaging is just so advanced that it's really difficult to keep up with. And I mean, I didn't really expect the Xperia to be able to compete with the Pixel in the computational imaging area. I mean, this is arguably one of, if not the best computational imaging cameras in the world in a phone. However, if you wanted to take a wide angle shot like this, you just can't. So there's nothing to compare it to with the Pixel. So on the 16 millimeter, you can take an image like this with the Sony that you just can't get with the Pixel. So that I very, very much enjoyed, and I really like having that wide angle lens. So that's a huge plus for the Sony versus the Pixel. Back to the sun, turning back around, we've got this old water tower, and we were literally shooting directly into the sun here. And you can see that the Pixel was able to use that computational imaging, and however it stacks together the images in order to come up with this, it does a great job with just dealing with that sunlight and pushing it right to the point of being blown out, but not obviously blown out, though it does have some ghosting in here underneath the water tower. But the Sony just couldn't deal with that bright sun. It doesn't have the computational imaging capability, and so you've got some purple fringing and some aberration here, and then you can see here on the sign that red outline and detail is a little bit too bright. That's not what you would see if you were looking at this. It would be much more like this in the Pixel, and so that T-Star coating, it's probably not made to deal with direct sunlight, but you do get a little flare here. You get a sunspot here from the Pixel, but pretty tough image for either of them to deal with. But again, the Pixel, it's amazing what that phone can do straight out of camera. And I can't remember if I said this before, but it was insanely hot out here on this day. And so as I was walking around, I started getting some messages on these phones that some of the features would be disabled. And so we had to go back to the house in order to finish out the tests. And so let's go back to the house and we'll go through some of the other features of the phone, including the selfie camera and some of the other features of just the main phone app. Okay, you can see we're back at the house here, and I started playing around with the selfie camera, the front-facing camera, and I'm not a big selfie guy, but it was okay. Nothing spectacular. And then the background blur, it was kind of hit or miss, and you can see some areas it struggled with. It obviously needs some work to catch up to the other phones. And here's that skin softening effect. I look plastic here, so I won't be using that very much. But here's the back-facing camera doing just a portrait, and it looks pretty good. And then when you turn on that background blur, to me it looks almost tilt shifty. It's kind of wonky to me. And then just for reference, this is the Photo Pro app taking a real portrait, and you can see how much the color changes when it's choosing the white balance through the Photo Pro app. And then the other morning I went outside and saw that the sunrise was just blazing, and so I took a couple of photos. Here's one with the regular camera app, and it struggled to catch that dynamic range like I really wanted to, so I flipped it into the Photo Pro app really quickly, and now I was able to take a super wide angle shot, something you can't do with the Pixel, and I thought it came out fantastic. Really got some great detail in the clouds and the color, and this is the kind of photo you can get with this camera with that Photo Pro app. And then just for some reference here, the main video app, I was able to sneak off a few videos out at the ghost town, and this first one with the 24 millimeters at 24 FPS, and I'm just walking along here, as you can tell, but it was pretty good stabilization considering I had to step over tires and into that small space and then wind my way into the front seat of this car, but it kept focus, and I think it did a pretty good job, and the color is really good. And then the 70 millimeter, of course, it's going to pick up every jitter, but it kept focus pretty well. You can see my steps, but again, it did a pretty good job considering how uncoordinated I was being just trying to get into this car, and it was so hot. And here's a super wide. Of course, this is going to be the best of all the image stabilization for the lenses, and this really looked pretty smooth to me, and it does a great job. Just straight out of this regular camera app, I thought that it could rival the iPhone just for the straight video app. It was that good. It's really, really impressive to me.
So all in all, like you've seen, I think that the phone performs just fine with the main camera app. But I have to admit, if I was looking for a phone that would give me fantastic performance with the main photo app, just point and shoot, this would probably not be it. I would definitely be checking out the Pixels or the Samsungs or the iPhones or maybe Huawei or other phones that have phenomenal point and shoot capability. But again, that is not what this phone is meant for. Where it really shines is in the Pro apps. So let's jump into the Photo Pro app and see how it performs there.
So what do you do when it's 112 degrees outside and your phones are shutting off because of the heat? Well, you create your own scene, of course. So what I did here was I put together some makeshift blinds. I put an orange gel on my light and kind of mimic morning sunlight coming through the blinds. And this is what we got. So now with the camera set up, let's walk through the different features of this Photo Pro app. Just to open up the Photo Pro, and you can see it looks very similar to the Sony Alpha menus, and you've got your modes here up on the left, and of course there's no aperture priority because it's a fixed aperture on all three lenses, but you've got some displays, so the histogram and a level, and then you've got your drive mode, and you've got focus area and your ISO. You can change that manually or leave that to auto. So that would allow you to use shutter priority and just make sure that you've got your ISO set to auto, and you decide what shutter speed you want to use, and you've got your light metering modes, and you can even decide what your white balance is. You could leave it to auto or decide that you want daylight. Or what's really cool about this is you can choose a custom white balance. And so how you do that is you take a white card or a white piece of paper, and then you just tap that, you press set, and that's it. You've got a custom white balance to your scene. And Sony just updated the software to this phone that now includes RAW and RAW plus JPEG capture, which is super powerful. So you can capture RAW images and they'll have a much higher dynamic range than a typical JPEG. And something to remember though is if you have RAW or RAW and JPEG capture selected, you're limited to single shooting only. I think the buffer just can't handle the continuous high or continuous low shooting yet. And that may be a software update that comes later, but we'll have to see. And of course you have a choice of autofocus or manual focus. And then your lenses are over here on the left, and you can choose your between the 3 lenses. And then another cool feature is that when you choose the lens, up on the top you can use your volume buttons to zoom in or zoom out, and it becomes limited to the lens you're on. So then you have to switch over and then go to the next lens to move up. But when you hit the 70mm lens to go higher than 70mm, you'll get a digital zoom, and it's the phone that's going to be using some computational imaging to mimic a longer zoom than the 70mm. And something else that's really cool is you have an exposure compensation value, and so you can just slide that up or down instead of going through all the different settings. If you're in a really quick situation, you want to grab a shot, and if you're in the photo pro mode, you can just slide that up or down to adjust your exposure really quickly. And then of course you've got your menus, and you've got your different aspects. You've got HDR, and you've got a dynamic range optimizer. You've got the soft skin effect that you could have on in even the Photo Pro app. You've got your eye autofocus, and that's for both humans and animals. So if you have that on, it'll look for an eye in either a human or an animal. And so I like to just leave that on. And you've got a few more settings in here that are kind of typical of any camera app. And one last thing that I almost forgot is that you have a dedicated shutter button on this phone, and that's right up here on the right hand corner. And it makes perfect sense for a phone like this to have a dedicated shutter, especially when you're using the Photo Pro app. Okay, so this is really where this phone and camera shines. In fact, this Xperia JPEG is straight out of camera. And here's the Pixel 4. I shot a raw image, and here's a raw file from the Xperia at 24mm and one at 16mm. And the great thing about these 3 images between the 16, the 24, and the 70s, I really didn't have to do much color correction between them. They were pretty close in their output. Of course, I'm using raw files, but looking at the 70mm and then cropping in to 150%, I mean, look at that detail. This is a phone camera. That is absolutely tremendous. And just for some comparison, I grabbed my Sony A7 III and I put that 24 to 105 G lens on there, which is a fantastic lens, and put it up against that 24mm from the Xperia, and look at the sharpness here. I mean, that's just absolutely fantastic. Look at the detail, and the color rendition out of this phone is just amazing to me. And then to see just how far we can push this, I took some photos in comparison for an ISO test, and the photos at 400 and 800, 1600 ISO were all very usable. It really only became apparent at ISO 3200 that we were pushing this camera and all that noise was introduced. And then back at the ghost town, I took this photo and wanted to see how it dealt with that dynamic range and a super underexposed photo. So I took a photo that was 3 stops underexposed with the Photo Pro app, and then bringing it up in post, you can see that it's a quite usable image. I mean, you have to really crop in to see that noise in the background. Otherwise, it did a great job. I mean, remember, this is a tiny, tiny piece of glass in a phone camera, and we're 3 stops underexposed, and I think it did a great job. Absolutely blown away at the capability of this Photo Pro app. It's really, really amazing to have this kind of control in a camera in a phone. And then moving on to test the eye autofocus and the face detection, my wife was gracious enough to model for us, and so I had her walk towards me, and the phone had absolutely no problem picking up her face. And then when she came into a little bit better lighting, it picked up her eye with no issues. And then doing continuous high-speed capture, it looks like that eye autofocus is a little bit off, but when you go back and look at the images, every single one of these is sharp, and they're all crisp. Even though I only had that shutter speed at 500, these images are great. So choosing an image here and zooming in, you could see that the detail is sharp all the way around. I mean, this is just incredible. This is a phone again. I mean, continuous high-speed shooting and using face detection. I'm super impressed.
So what did you think? Was the Profile app what you expected, and were the images as good as you expected? I have to admit, as a photographer living with this phone for the last week, I've been finding myself grabbing the phone and opening up that Photo Pro app and being really excited to take some photos as if I was using my big alpha camera. And a lot of the images I got were every bit as good as I hoped they would be. But what about you? Leave a comment below and let me know if you like the Photo Pro app and whether that's the experience you're looking for in this phone. Now let's dive into the Cinema Pro app and see what the full video capabilities are of this phone.
Okay, so jumping into the Camera Pro app, you can see here that this interface looks exactly like the Sony professional video cameras. And because of that, the way you do this is you create a project, and we'll just name this the Xperia Review, but a little pro tip here is just create a number of projects, one for each resolution and each frame rate, and that'll make it super easy to go between resolution and frame rates. You can see here you can choose your resolution, and then you can choose your frame rate, and it goes all the way up to 60 frames per second at 4K. And of course you can change your ISO. And one of the things that many professional cameras do is they use the degree rules. So using 180 degrees means that you would be double the frame rate for your shutter speed. So if you're using 24 frames per second, you're going to use 1/48 of a second for your shutter speed. And that's great because it's not 1/50th. I mean, it's right on the dot, and it does the calculation for you. And something that's also included in the Cinema Pro app is the choice to put different color overlays, so you can burn that right into your JPEG footage, and you can get that Venice look right here in camera, and it'd be ready to go if you wanted to upload it to social media. It's right there in the app for you to use. So we're back at the original flower scene here, and I wanted to show you something that I discovered when I was playing around with the Cinema Pro app. It's here in this autofocus. When you hit manual focus, you can set different focus points. So if we tap on the flowers here for some close focus, that could be our point A. And then if we tap the back flowers, that could be our point B. And now the camera will automatically pull focus nice and slowly from A to B for us. And it's smooth and it's super accurate. So this is a really, really cool feature of the Cinema Pro app. And now some examples of the type of footage you can get straight out of the camera with this Cinema Pro app. Here's 24 frames per second at 4K, and then 60 frames per second at 1080p. I mean, look at how sharp that is. I mean, this is fantastic straight out of camera. And then here's the 60 frames per second at 4K. And I was trying not to get stung by other honeybees that were around here. And so I might have moved a little bit too quickly and scared this guy off. But this video is getting super long. I think I hit on just about all the different types of images and videos you can get out of this. And so we'll wrap it up here.
Okay, so don't forget to check out the full preview of this phone if you want to see all the specs and details of the Xperia 1 Mark II. I'll leave a link in the description below and you can check that out. I hope this video helps you decide whether the Xperia is right for you, and if you feel like it did, please hit that like button, as that really does help. And if you haven't already, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and that little notification bell to stay in the loop around here, and I'll see you in the next video.